The Appalachian Mountains are some of the oldest in the world, and we just happen to live in them. One thing we can tell you, there are ghosts in the mountains. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another wonderful episode of the Ghosts in the Mountains podcast. Unfortunately, I am your host, Caleb Hanks, but fortunately, I am here with some pretty wonderful folk. I am, as always, joined by my good friend and your great co-host, Mr. Austin Burgess. Austin, how the hell are you, buddy?
I am doing quite well tonight, man. How are you doing?
Man, I don't think I could be any better because the day has finally come. We've been talking about on this podcast for the longest time that we were going to get him in the studio. And boys, let me tell you, we did. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Joshua P. Warren. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, we've got somebody. We've been joking that we're going to get Warren on the podcast, but we got somebody even more near and dear to my heart. I am very, very excited to have, number one, a guest on the show, and secondarily, the guest on the show, because
The inaugural guest, and it only makes sense that he would be here. He was very instrumental in us even starting this podcast. So let me introduce to you and welcome the great Micah Hanks, my brother, Micah Hanks. Bro, how you doing tonight?
Well, I'm doing wonderful. Good to be here, guys. Of course, here in the high and I'll say the windy and chilly mountains of Appalachia tonight. I couldn't imagine a better time to get together right here to convene. Have you named your studio, by the way? Is it called the Lardis?
Right now, well, I was calling it the TARDIS, but the Lardis I think works very well. Yeah, I don't know. I need to name it something spookier for the podcast. So
yeah, something more branded, right?
Why don't you just call it the Shell?
We'll just call it. Yeah, I don't know. We'll call it the room, the happening. I don't know. Frick it. Anyway, so the bro is here with us in studio, and there's a reason that he's here. He's not just here BSing with us, although I would be happy doing, that all night, because it is very fun to talk to the bro. It's kind of hard to stay on topic because Micah is a veritable vault of knowledge of everything that you could ever think of paranormal. And tonight we wanted to bring him in on something very, very specific because, literally, the dude wrote the book on it. Tonight, we are going to be talking about a place that's very, very strange here in Western North Carolina, and also a place that I don't think a lot of people know about. We've covered the Grove Park Inn, the Pink Lady phenomenon there, Helen's Bridge. I think that if you live anywhere near the area, and some people that aren't even from the area have maybe even heard of like the Pink Lady of the Grove Park Inn or some place like Helen's Bridge. But one place that I don't think many people, unless you are maybe in the paranormal circles, I don't think you might have heard of this place. But tonight, the topic is going to be a place called the Reynolds Mansion. And the Reynolds Mansion is, first and foremost, just a historical wonder here in Asheville in Western North Carolina. I don't think that technically it's in Weaverville, but it's close enough to it to where it feels like it. It's on the road out there.
I think it's Woodfin, right?
Yeah, essentially Woodfin. Which, Asheville, you're in downtown, you take Merriman Avenue, past Beaver Lake, you're pretty much there. But just a very, very strange place. And you can actually see it from the interstate if you're heading out towards Barnardsville, I believe. But it's not one of those things where you see it, while you're driving and it's this big, crazy thing sticking out at you and you're like, oh, I wonder what that is. If you know what you're looking for, you can definitely see it. But it really is kind of a hidden gem. But it is a very, very strange place. And we brought in the bro, the expert, to tell us all about it because he's experienced some strange stuff. I have been there. And even though, Austin, you're the boots on the ground guy. Wow, what a slacker.
Yeah,
No, I'm just
didn't
kidding.
make it there this week.
Well, yeah.
I knew we had Micah, so I slacked off a little bit this week.
Well, I have to say, I mean, man, you've done so much for the podcast so far. I mean, you get a day off. You get a pass on this one. But I think how we need to start it off, number one, there might be a very, very select few people that are listening to this podcast that somehow know us and don't know the bro. And that's a really, really weird thing if so, because Micah has dedicated his life to, God, I don't want to misidentify how you perceive like what it is that you've been doing, but I just want to say that the bro has dedicated his life to all things strange for what, 20, 30 years at this point? I mean, Micah, I'm just going to mess it up. Why don't you address the audience and just tell them like who you are and what you do?
Yeah, that's a good question. Tell you the truth. I mean, honestly, ever since we were kids, I was always really interested in all this stuff. Our mother, and you probably know this, Austin, our mother, Linda, used to love to have bonfires at night, and she would take us out and she would have us sit out there at the bonfire and she would tell ghost stories. Not just ghost stories. I mean, we'd talk about science fiction. We'd talk about music. We would talk about, family history, all kinds of stuff.
But inevitably, she'd scare the crap out of us.
Oh, yeah. I feel like that's such a rite of passage for so many people.
Totally is, yeah. And for us, the UFOs and the ghosts and the Sasquatches, or boojums, I should say. I think your listeners would be more familiar with that term. I mean, we heard all these stories when we were kids. And, for me, I think I had a natural interest in reading at an early age. My parents worked with me on that, so when I was one of those kids who went into like kindergarten able to write his name and read a few words, I am learning.
Boy, I wasn't.
Yeah, right. Yeah, actually you were.
I went into kindergarten they're like, we're going to need an extra bib for this one.
No, that's not true at all, actually. No, again, our mother's an artist and she was always encouraging us to write, to draw, to, to paint, to do things like that and to read. And so I was in kindergarten and, I came home from school and was learning, how to read from the books that they gave us, which were about these characters, Mike, Mary, and Jeff. And I said, I'd like books about those characters Mom talks about. Travis Walton, Peter Byrne, right? Tell me about the Pink Lady of the Grove Park Inn. Tell me about the ghost that haunts 191 down here. Tell me about the Brown Mountain Lights. Tell me about the Devil's Tramping Ground. Tell me about, all these stories.
And boy, did she.
Well, what I said was, I want books. Where can I read books about those things instead of Mike, Mary, and Jeff go to the mall, And so,
yeah.
So Mom and Dad gave me these books, and actually, we have still, managed to preserve some of these relics over the years.
Bro, you're going to come on the podcast and immediately shit on C-Spot Run?
You're damn right. No, the books that they gave us, there was Peter Byrne's Bigfoot book, which was The Search for Bigfoot, Man, Myth, or Monster. Ivan Sanderson, who was a Scottish zoologist who wrote an early book on Bigfoot called Abominable Snowman Legend Come to Life. And then also there was a book by a guy, I believe a Scottish writer also, or may have been Irish, but Peter Costello, that was a book about lake monsters.
Yeah.
And then there was also a couple of more. There was a book by Ray Fowler called UFOs, Interplanetary Visitors. And then finally, there was also just a book about ghosts and poltergeists.
And how old were you when you started reading all these?
5.
Indoctrinated at a young age, right?
Yeah, and some would say that's exactly what it was. They were like, well, you were indoctrinated. Your parents gave you things, and they were pushing this stuff on you. No.
I don't know. There was a little bit of that.
There was, but I think that the thing is and what I've always tried to be clear about is that my father has always been, a science-minded person, even though, of course, he ended up becoming an Anglican priest for years. But when I was a kid, my experience growing up in our household with my dad, if I got in trouble, he was like, okay, you're going to write the Greek alphabet backwards because he was a master of languages, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, some Aramaic languages and things.
You and I were punished very differently.
Yeah.
I just got my ass beat.
But when I was like studying, biology and things like that in grade school, Dad would go get his biology and his mathematics textbooks. And we would reference these things, right, in my homework. And I remember literally going to school in 5th grade and my teacher saying, I'm trying to understand your answers to this biology paper and the questions I gave you. You're right. But she says the way that you've written this is not in your textbook. I said, well, it's because I was reading my dad's college book. And so my teachers are like, okay, cool, he can read. So the point is, again, there was both a balance of science and mathematics and history, but also then the folklore side of things. And that's why I would still call it today. But for my own part, that early, upraising, in that area of thinking both scientifically but also being open to these things kind of made me a good skeptic, and that's still where I am these days. And ultimately, that quest brought me to the Reynolds Mansion.
Indeed. Well, I've mentioned on the podcast before that the brother and I hold on to one specific relic. Well, he's got the bundle of relics, but there was one that the Bigfoot book. And who was the author?
That was the Peter Byrne book. And, I interviewed him before he died.
Oh, my God, dude. Yeah.
That's full circle.
Mm-hmm.
I unfortunately did not get to listen to that, but I need to find that. But the book that I think influenced both of us the most, and I've told this on the pod a couple of times now, but scared us so badly that we literally locked it in a drawer and did not take it out for, I think, probably 2 years or more. But it's seen some wear and tear. The spine of the book came apart and the book was split into two. And so the brothers had to split the power of the Horcrux. And now you have the second half of the book, and I was lucky enough to get the cover. And I have a room in my house, which is weird because I'm still very much on the fence about Sasquatch. I have no bones about saying that. I want to believe, but I still need substantial evidence. But that does not stop me from having an entire room in my house dedicated and decorated to and by, not by a Sasquatch. He didn't come into the house. Christopher Lowell.
All the proof you need.
Is a Sasquatch. But yeah, I got the Sasquatch room anyway. So
I've had journalists, hardcore old school journalists call me up and they'll be like, love your science reporting and I like your astronomy and your archaeology and your physics stuff. And what do you think about Sasquatch? You don't believe in that, do you? And they've dug deep enough and they've seen my old articles and stuff on Sasquatch. And I'll respond and be like, listen, here, and this literally happened actually with a career journalist from New York. He called me up and he was kind of giving me a hard time. And I said, you used to write for publications that were put out by the Archaeological Society of America. What anthropologist would not be fascinated with the prospect that, again, what scientists would call a relict hominoid, something that resembles humans, right? But that is not, again, Homo sapiens sapiens, something maybe closer to Neanderthal, maybe closer to something from earlier times, maybe even like Gigantopithecus, the Pleistocene megafaunal ape species that existed in Asia, right? I mean, if something like that still existed today, anthropologists and frankly all scientists would be fascinated. And again, you can make fun of these topics all you want to, but there are more and more scientists who are beginning to take subjects like these seriously. And I hope that as much as we've kind of seen with the UAP subject in recent years and the so-called glass ceiling kind of breaking, military intelligence and scientists, again, former Harvard astronomer Avi Loeb, the Frank Baird professor of astronomy at Harvard University, I'm going to be talking with him next Friday, and that we have people like that who are seriously looking at this subject. I mean, it's incredible, but I've always said next, I hope Sasquatch happens. And, maybe we can extend that to some of the lingering questions about what currently we relegate to folklore. But to your point, I'm skeptical too. You got to be. Good science is skeptical, but it also doesn't rule out possibilities. So since childhood, I've maintained my interest in all these topics. And if anybody doesn't like that and they don't like that he decorates part of his house with Sasquatches,
then get out of my house.
What are you doing? Who let you
get in here, you freak?
Exactly. Go to hell. I don't care, I mean, I have no time for people.
Oh, yeah, man. I mean, dude, I think the reason at the core of why you and I think flocked to those specific books, Loch Ness, Abominable Snowman, Bigfoot. And
I hate those abdominal snowmen.
Oh, dude, I get them all the time. I get abdominal snowballs. But I think the reason that we gravitated towards it and why it had such an influence on us at an early age, and obviously this is played throughout the rest of our lives, is it is the sense of wonder. It is the sense of there is something else out there. There has to be. We have to find something else out there because as beautiful as Inca Candler, where we went to school, was and wasn't, we had to know in our heart of hearts, there's got to be something else out there. And I think that these books were the first time that we're wait a second, you're telling me I'm trying to sleep on a planet where there's these big things walking around outside. And it was partly the fear, but also and this is another reason why, Austin, you and I have started this thing. You're talking about we're sitting around the campfire as kids and mom is telling us this stuff. Some of the stuff that mom told us scared me so badly.
Like what?
God. Well, the one that has always kind of stuck in my mind, and I'm just going to paraphrase this because it's the longer one, but there was a story that mother told where there was essentially a woman that was dying of throat cancer, and that as she was passing away, and this is one that I think that we should talk about on a future episode because this one is crazy, but There was this whole thing about owls kind of coming around the windows as she was passing away. And then there was a particular sound that she would make. And then they heard that sound coming from the chimney of the house reportedly after the woman had passed. And for some reason, stories like that just like really, really stuck with me. And, by the time you and I were, I was probably 15, I was probably around 15 and you would have been 18. That's when our buddy Noah has the night vision camera. You and I are out. We're out of the house. We've got the night vision camera. We didn't have the best taste. Well, we didn't buy this record. Noah was playing it. He was playing the first Nickelback album. There were a couple of cuts on that one that weren't super douchey, but we were like out going to places like the Grove Park Inn. We're looking into this stuff. People know the bro as the UFO guy at this point, but we cut our teeth on all this stuff.
Yeah.
Like all the paranormal stuff.
So y'all had your own like pre-Lemur paranormal team almost.
We did. Para, which Micah came up with the name of, Paranormal Anomaly Research Association. Don't take it. I'm buying the domain.
What a great name.
Yeah.
Very, very, understandable. Easy to see what it is.
I keep saying we should bring it back.
Yeah.
But we need some tri-fields first. So if anyone, if anyone has a tri-field, not the gold plate, the blue faceplate, please let us know. Please contact ghostinthemountains@gmail.com. But I digress. Bro, so you and I obviously grow up interested in all this stuff. We get into the paranormal investigation stuff. We become lemurs. We literally become human lemur hybrids.
I don't know how we did it either.
Your transition back to humans is pretty impressive too.
It was kind of a transcension, really.
Oh, yeah.
It took about 14 years for the hair to stop growing in weird places, but here we are. I've said it multiple times on the podcast, but Micah and I were part of the League of Energy Materialization and Unexplained Phenomena Research with a silent P, with people like Brian Irish and Josh Warren. We are in the field doing paranormal investigation. So at the point where you end up going to the Reynolds Mansion, this is years after you and I were both in Lemur. So I don't want to get off the subject. I am interested in, how did you find out about the Reynolds Mansion? Like, how did you end up there?
Yeah. Well, so, back when we were doing the investigations with Lemur, again, our good friend Joshua Warren, he now lives out there in Las Vegas. I haven't seen Josh in a couple of years, but every now and then, I'll still get a message from him. We keep in touch, periodically. But one of the people we met back in those days who was an associate of Josh's had been a woman named Marty Marfia.
Yeah, I remember Marty.
And Marty, she would keep in touch. And at the time, I just moved out to the kind of East Asheville area. And in fact, actually, I believe around the time probably that Marty called me, I'd been working on what would have been my first major publication book about UFOs, a book called The UFO Singularity. I was in negotiations with the publishers at that time. And so out of the blue, I get this phone call one morning from Marty Marfia, and she was calling just to check in, see what was going on. And she said, listen, I am now working at a bed and breakfast that's opened up here in North Asheville, literally right on the border between Asheville proper and Woodfin. And so she says, I cannot wait for you to come up here and see this place. And I said, well, that's nice, and great to hear from you, Marty, and I'll look forward to coming out there sometime. And she says, and in fact, I got to go up there this afternoon if you want to come along. And I said, well, I don't know about today. And she says, please, is there any way? And I said, okay, all right. So I end up canceling some stuff that afternoon. And I drive up to North Asheville, completely on this whim at the request of Miss Marty Marfia. And so I go up there and meet Marty. She gives me the directions. You drive up this long driveway to get up to the top. And actually what you'll do is you'll drive through the Reynolds Mountain apartment complex.
Oh, Reynolds Village is what it's called, right?
That's right.
Yeah. It's almost like a shopping center.
Yeah.
Now.
Well, now they have, there's all kinds of shops, restaurants, things like that and everything. And then there are the apartment buildings. And you drive up through all that. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, and I had no idea it was up there until Marty told me about this. But to answer your question, Caleb, that's how I found out. She calls and she says, come up here today. I want you to meet Billy, the owner, and see this place. So I go up there, and I had no idea that there was quite literally a 3-story mansion, like a double pile, federal-style mansion. The thing was built in 1847, and that this is up there on the hill. And in fact, a lot of people didn't know it was up there because it had fallen into such a state of decay and was in such bad shape back just a few decades ago that, I mean, it was already, I think the intention had been to try and someone acquire it so they could tear it down and they could probably build more apartment buildings and homes and things up there on the mountain. As it turns out, Billy, who was the owner who bought it, and he's no longer the owner, but he bought it and ended up, kind of rehabilitating this home with holes in the roof and everything, doing the restorations. Billy and his partner, Michael, when they acquired it, they took it from unlivable, falling apart, to restoring it almost to the way it looked, presumably at the height of its, livability. And that would have been, I would say, maybe in the 1930s or 40s.
Yeah.
But again, keeping in mind, this house dates back to 1847, so it is officially one of the oldest buildings in the entire area, in the entire county. It is now on the Asheville, or the Register of Historical Places.
Uh-huh.
And you said, what year did they start restoring it?
They would have acquired it maybe back,
2009?
Yeah, somewhere around 2009 or 2010, and I went up there for the first time maybe in it would have been maybe late 2011 or early 2012.
And I'm sorry, it was abandoned at that point.
Well, before they bought it.
Right.
It had been, I think at one time there had been, funny enough, and again, as I got to know Billy, and I can talk a little more about this, but there had, I think, been like a group of hippies basically who had been living back in the 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah, at one point. But there had been various people who had occupied the place over the years. I go up there, long story short, to meet Marty, and she says, come in, I want to give you a tour. I want you to meet Billy. And, when you first meet Billy, he's fascinating. He's still a friend to this day. He and his partner, Michael, they now live down near Bluffton. And I'll, if I'm on television talking about UFOs or anything and Billy sees it, I'll get a text message, so it's wonderful to always hear from him. But when I showed up at the house, you get to the house, there's this beautiful 3-story mansion with these wraparound porches, beautiful, beautiful gardens. And I go inside and there's this guy standing there. And again, he's sun-tanned and he's got, blonde hair, looks like a guy who you'd expect to be, out, working on rooftops or something like that, which incidentally, actually, he did that kind of work for years. And you go up to meet him, and it's funny because here's this kind of, macho-looking dude, and he takes you by the hand, and he's got a very soft touch, and, hey there, welcome. So glad to have you here. And it was always really cute. I always thought, Billy's like an old mistress of an old, inn or a hotel or something who's trapped in like a young man's body.
Yeah.
He just had this timeless kind of thing about him. And so we became friends immediately. He takes me inside and he's showing me the library and he's showing me, all the rooms. And Marty says, well, Micah here, he's interested in ghosts and stuff like that. And I said, well, I used to do a lot more of that. But she had her heart set on the idea. She's like, somebody should write a book about this house. And she really introduced that idea to Billy, and he loved it too. So again, what ended up happening was Billy would just invite me up, and he would say, I'll give you access to all the documentation, all the files, all the history of the house that we have. Come up and stay, spend some time here, and just know that in addition to the history that I'll tell you about, some people tell us about some strange things they have experienced up here too. And I was like, you kidding me? A place like this? No.
Yeah.
Never.
Say it ain't so.
At this point, you'd kind of been out of we're going to go and do an investigation thing for a minute. Like, you're not taking around a Gossmaster with you everywhere.
I'd gotten to the point, literally, where, early on, like you had said, when you're kids or even in your teens and you're interested in the idea of, what can you explore about your area, and you start reading about the folklore and you start following up on the legends and the stories and things, and then that may take you a little further if you get serious about investigation, either historically or otherwise. Yeah, I'd always had that interest in the quote-unquote paranormal. And then I had actually gone through this kind of period of getting really kind of jaded.
Sure.
And kind of feeling like, I'm less interested in the claims, and I want to study the things that seem to have some sort of a more tangible basis, which really, again, the relic hominoid idea that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, understood.
Obviously, I'm best known with the whole UFO thing, but
I get it. I kind of fell out of the ghost stuff for 17 years or something?
yeah, again, in the back of your mind, there's always that interest in what I would continue to call folklore, but I don't know. I've talked to so many people over the years who've had these experiences, including people who had stayed at Reynolds Mansion.
Right.
And had experiences. And again, so it was funny how that book that I ended up writing about that house and the experience of going and spending a lot of time up there talking to Billy, talking to Marty, talking to others, it kind of brought me back into the whole situation of thinking, what is it about a house that becomes a natural laboratory? And that's how I thought of it when I was up there. I'm thinking to myself, initially a little resistant to wanting to go up there and having to write a book about it.
Go up there and
Well, no, literally, I end up kind of going into the situation, seeing this beautiful house, making these friends with, I already knew Marty, but, with a new friend, Billy Sanders, the owner of the home and everything, and getting to know the staff there. I ended up kind of, I guess, evolving this way of thinking about it in terms of it being like, this is a laboratory where I can go and I can conduct experiments. And so the scientific tools I would bring in, and I did the first time I went up there, were a notepad and a pencil. Because ultimately Billy said, there aren't going to be but maybe 1 or 2 guests on this particular night. You'll have, free reign of the house. Would you want to come up here and stay in the most haunted room? And I said, sign me up. So I did.
He was equipped with nothing but a notepad, a pencil, some dowsing rods, and some Captain's wafers.
There were Captain's wafers. Yeah.
Well,
might have been a glass of brandy too. I won't lie.
Before we get more into, your experiences with the place, I think it's probably pertinent that we tell people a little bit about the house and kind of, paint a picture of the history of like why this place is relatively significant. Because I think that the history is actually pretty fascinating, and that also kind of sets up some of the stuff that you're going to go into a little bit later, and some of the experiences that you heard secondhand, and then, some of the stuff that you experienced firsthand. So, Austin.
Yeah.
The research monster. Stone Cold E.T. Austin Burgess.
Never heard of that one.
I know. And look, here's the thing. I know that you've grown up people calling you Stone Cold, but I feel being Stone Cold E.T. Austin Burgess, I don't think there's any higher honor.
Well, I appreciate it.
But either way, you are the research monster, because literally every single time I get in here and we start doing this podcast, dude, you blow my mind with the crazy stuff that you've been able to figure out. And I will say, just preemptively, I really do hope that we're able to bring the bro in on a couple of other crazier episodes later on, because I think there's going to be some ones where the 3 of us in the room, it's going to make some sense for us all to be here, because, well, I'll just say there's one particular project that me and Austin have near and dear to our hearts, and I think it's going to be kind of an ongoing thing, but I digress. We will want you back already, but Austin, dude, so you want to give us a little bit of a background on this place, because I don't know much about it. I do, but you're going to have the facts.
So I will say majority of my research came from Micah's book. I read that through this weekend. Really enjoyed it. It was a nice, quick read. Before we get into the history, I will touch on this. As you mentioned, I think your professional interest had really kind of shifted towards the UFO topic at the time. So I really did respect that within the first few pages of the book, you managed to slip a UFO reference in there.
Nice.
So that was pretty nice.
That was obviously kind of what I was working on at that time, which is funny because my earlier research had more to do with consciousness and things along those lines.
Yeah.
And which was sort of an outgrowth of the interest in the paranormal, if you want to call it that. I always kind of had that word sort of, I don't know. The supernatural, anything but paranormal. I've never considered myself a paranormal researcher, but all that said.
Fortean, right?
Yeah, Forteana, right? The tradition of Charles Hoy Fort, who was the first guy who would classify, again, what he deemed to be phenomena that were rife throughout science literature, periodicals, and things like that, and which he said smacked the face of modern science, right? He embraced being heretical. And, that idea of heretical science, or again, to borrow a term, and actually there's a wonderful series of books, and I'm reviewing this 6th installment of this series, but Forbidden Science by Dr. Jacques Vallée, his personal journals. That idea of forbidden topics that science won't address, but which, again, seem to share a position throughout time in the, continuity of the human experience. That's always fascinated me. And again, ghosts fall into that, as do aerial phenomena and other things. But yes.
Understood.
You can tell from the first chapter of Reynolds Mansion.
Oh, it's the first few pages. Spot on.
I'm immediately already talking about UFOs and how I wake up in this weird house.
Yeah, exactly.
Where am I?
So let's dive into some of the history here. And Micah, of course, feel free to jump in. I know you have a lot more context on some of this stuff. Just trying to give a little brief overview here. But as you mentioned, Reynolds Mansion was built in 1847 by a man named Daniel Reynolds, built on top of a hill right outside of Asheville, what is presently kind of known as Woodfin. Similar to what we described in the Smith-McDowell episode, most of the homes in this area around that time were built as log cabins. So this huge double pile brick home was something that really only the wealthiest of the area were able to afford at the time. Daniel would go on to be elected to a one-term position as a Buncombe County trustee in 1850. And 4 years later, he would go on to challenge his cousin-in-law, Zebulon Vance, which is, kind of well-known name around this area, for a seat in the North Carolina House of Commons. From what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, Micah, both men were members of the Whig Party, but they had differing ideologies on the topic of slavery.
Yeah, which was pretty common at the time.
Yeah. I think, Vance supported the continuation of slavery through the Compromise of 1850, while Reynolds was a little more opposed to the idea of expanding slavery within the United States, despite him using the labor of 15 enslaved people to construct the mansion. So when Daniel passed in 1878, his son William Reynolds went on to inherit the house and the remaining 140 acres or so that was left of the estate after kind of the Civil War hardships that some of the property had gone through. William married a woman named Mamie Spears. Is that right?
Yeah.
In 1880, and they had 4 kids, one of whom is Robert Rice Reynolds, who would go on to become a U.S. Senator in the 1930s. And despite owning this impressive home, William and his family chose to live closer to town, outside near a property on Woodfin Street, is what I have seen.
Yeah, they wanted to have that nice, luxurious, modern living, right?
Yeah.
But the house still sit up there on the hill.
Yeah. So from my understanding, eventually around 1890, William decided to sell the house and the land to his brother Nathaniel. And William later passed on shortly after in 1892. But within a few years of William's passing, Mamie decided to remarry her deceased husband's brother, Nathaniel.
Yeah, this is kind of strange, but that really happened, yeah.
I feel like that kind of happened a lot back in the day.
That support system, I guess.
Well, exactly. Yeah, I feel like I've heard that so many times.
So Mamie and Nathaniel chose to continue living in their house outside of the mansion, not really making a lot of use of the property at the time. For a period in the 1920s, the house was actually rented out to Dr. Elizabeth Smith, who turned the house into an osteopathic sanatorium for tuberculosis patients.
Right, yeah.
Which, that's pretty common across a lot of these stories that we've been digging into. People coming to Asheville as a health retreat specifically for tuberculosis.
Yeah, it was believed, of course, you talked about Edwin Grove.
Mm-hmm.
And he believed that he had come here and that the mountain air cured him. And it was very much a belief at that time that the pure air here in the mountains, had a healing property. And so the sanatoriums were kind of popular. And indeed, Reynolds Mansion for a time had been operated as one.
So Nathaniel would go on to renovate the mansion. He added a 3rd story, another kitchen, and some of the wraparound patios that are present that you see at the mansion today. These renovations kind of gave it a little bit more of a colonial revival style, which was apparently pretty popular at the time. Another kind of interesting fact is that Nathaniel worked as a funeral director in the area, and reportedly he would occasionally use the separate garage building to work on embalming practices for the funeral home.
Yes, that seems to have been confirmed at some point.
Weird.
Talk about bringing your work home.
Yeah.
It gets weirder later on involving this. We'll tell you why later. Stay tuned, folks.
So eventually, Nathaniel decided to move back to the mansion with 2 of their grandchildren from Mamie's son, Robert Reynolds. While he was serving in Washington, they were kind of watching after his children. The mansion also served as a kind of home base for Senator Reynolds, or Bunkum Bob, as he was sometimes referred to, whenever he was in Asheville visiting during his time serving in office. During his time working in Washington, Robert was introduced to Evelyn McLean, who was the owner of the famous Hope Diamond. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes. Who had a daughter, now get this, her name Evelyn Walsh McLean. She had a daughter, Evelyn Washington McLean.
She went by Evie, right?
She went by Evie, yeah. They had to kind of switch things up because, somebody walks into the room and says, Evelyn, they both turn around and look, got kind of confusing. So Evie, the daughter, yeah. And of course, that daughter went on to marry our Bob, Senator Reynolds.
Yeah. So they had a daughter, adding to the confusion here, that they named Mamie Spears Reynolds, right? After Robert's mother.
Yeah.
So a little bit of crossover on some of these names that we're seeing here.
Mamie has actually been to the Reynolds Mansion, I believe, and I'm not sure she's still alive, but I know she was older back when I was going up there. Never had the opportunity to meet Mamie, but
okay.
I mean, yeah, she was still alive, cool. I believe, at that time, though, yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the Hope Diamond. I think it's pretty notorious for being believed to have a curse associated with it.
Yeah.
Do you know much about that?
It's the curse of Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yeah. The Hope Diamond, again, there are a lot of romantic stories that are associated with it that included that in this statue of a Khan or something along those lines, that the jewel had actually been in the eyepiece and it had been stolen.
Yeah, I think it was a Hindu statue.
Something along those lines.
From what I understood, yeah.
Now, you can read online about the history of it. In fact, there have been some decent books written about the Hope Diamond. We do know that it appeared and that there were drawings of it, and then when it actually disappears and then reappears, it had apparently gone through the cutting process and had been, hewn from the rough shape down to a more finely polished jewel.
Mm-hmm.
The Hope Diamond, again, ultimately makes its way, of course, to Evelyn Washington McLean through her mother, Evelyn Walsh McLean. So Evie, in other words, who became the wife of Senator Bob Reynolds, was the heiress of the Hope Diamond. Now, there's this long-held idea of there being a curse associated with the diamond. And indeed, that's, an intriguing part of the whole story about the Reynolds Mansion, because again, Bob Reynolds, when he was the senator, he didn't spend a lot of time at Reynolds Mansion, but he certainly would have gone there. Presumably Evie had gone there. Supposedly they would come there and almost used it kind of like, as I was told, sort of almost like a summer home. They would bring their dog there. There is a replica, or at least when Billy and Michael had been the owners of Reynolds Mansion, there had certainly been
the dog?
A replica of the diamond. Yeah. But there was a replica of the dog, too.
Speaking of the dog, I ran across some pretty interesting stories that they used to attach the diamond literally to the collar of this Great Dane and just let him roam around the property.
That was the story, yeah. Evie would take the diamond and put it around the dog's neck and let it run around carrying the priceless Hope Diamond around its neck.
Yeah, he's not going to roll around in a dead possum somewhere in the middle of the woods and have that thing shake off his neck. No big deal.
Yeah. Now, in the I guess I would call it the drawing room, but really kind of the parlor area or whatever, this nice room right across from the library there on the first floor of the mansion, there is a portrait of Evie. And, again, I describe it in the book, below the snowfall of her neck is the blue jewel hanging right there. It's a beautiful portrait. There was an artist out of Chicago who was commissioned to do all the portraits that appeared in the Reynolds Mansion. And, Billy had a proclivity, I think, that I sort of share for the macabre. He really enjoyed horror fiction and stuff like that. And so you walk into the library and there's a portrait of Barnabas Collins from Dark Shadows.
Boom.
And there's a portrait of the picture of Dorian Gray. And all the guests would come up there and always say that they said the author of the book resembles Dorian Gray, the young Dorian Gray in the painting. Yeah. So, again, I was worked into the mythos up there too. But there was the painting of Evie. And Evie's painting always captivated me. I remember the first night I spent up there, I spent a long night wandering around the entire mansion, but I would go in there and the brandy was set up on a little, serving tray right in front of that portrait of Evie. And I was always captivated by the portrait of her with the diamond, the Hope Diamond. So anyway, the story had been that, Evie, the heiress to the diamond, she's married to Bob. She suffered from depression. And one night, presumably this would have occurred at their Washington home, the story had been that Evelyn Walsh McLean asked Bob, "Marry my daughter, take care of her." He wanted somebody to look after his daughter. So they had become acquainted. She introduces Bob to her daughter, and basically they end up kind of getting married. Not really through an arrangement, but I guess sort of through a, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, marry a senator, honey. And she's talking to him and saying, "I trust you. I need somebody, to marry my daughter." Evie suffered from depression.
Yeah.
And so one night she locks herself in her room and she takes, sleeping pills, and she takes a dose that, of course, ultimately ending her life. After her death, the Hope Diamond eventually, I guess, ends up coming into the ownership technically of Bob Reynolds. And I believe it had been Bob who made the official donation to the Smithsonian Institute.
Man.
But even at that point, here's the crazy thing. So the owner, the heiress of the Hope Diamond, which had long been renowned as not only a beautiful, incomparable diamond to any other jewel in the world, but also reportedly cursed, she dies. So Bob says, I'm going to loan this thing indefinitely to the Smithsonian. Take it away, get it up there. So the messenger who's carrying the parcel, he has to deliver the diamond to the Smithsonian. He's on a bike, and he suffers an accident on the bike. I don't know if he was killed, but I know that he was.
Of course he did.
He was badly injured. Yeah, and so it just continued to contribute to this idea that stay away from this diamond. Now,
Can I just say, though, real quick, one of the things that has kind of been a recurring motif on this show is that Asheville is a vortex for the weird. And is it just not hilarious to you guys that this famous cursed diamond just happens to end up at the Reynolds Mansion here in town? I mean, to me, it's just another little thing on this big weird map of crazy pinpoints of just weird shit that this town has
Most
experienced.
people don't know that. And in fact, I would never have known that had it not been that my longtime friend Marty Murphy had just called me up randomly and said, "Hey, I'm working at this new bed and breakfast."
That's wild.
Yeah, so it was there were a lot of little synchronicities that came, into the whole story as it related to me going up there. But yeah, for sure, I mean, the Hope Diamond Again, you might not say is a huge part of the history of the house, but the fact that that house has a direct connection with the famous Hope Diamond.
Yeah. I mean, that's just a huge piece of history, regardless of paranormal, supernatural or not. That's a piece of U.S. history or world history for that matter.
It is.
I've got a pretty interesting quote. So young Mamie was quoted saying that it's just a plain piece of rock as far as I'm concerned. I do know that it's very beautiful, but who on earth wants a giant rock like that? It's where it belongs. In a museum.
Yeah, and again, you can go to the Smithsonian, you can see it. Interesting thing is, though, that a lot of people don't know this, but the Hope Diamond changes color slightly throughout the year. There's some sort of a component of, in terms of the nitrogen content in the diamond itself. I guess being a diamond, it's presumably carbon-based, right?
Sure.
Right, with a cubic structure. Crystalline structure. There are, in rare instances, six-sided diamond-like structures that can occur in nature, but I digress. Anyway, in terms of the I guess the geology, right, of the stone itself and everything, there's something about the nitrogen content, as I understand it. I read about this years ago, and I don't remember all the specifics, but it causes it to take on a pinkish hue at certain times of the year, and you can actually see that in certain photographs when people have taken photographs of it at various times.
That doesn't have anything to do with the temperature?
I don't know. I'm not
That's
sure.
Odd. Super weird.
Can't say.
Can't say.
Interesting. So by the 1960s, the Reynolds family no longer had owned the house. They had sold it off. It changed hands a couple of times before being purchased by Fred and Helen Faber in 1970. And the place was in pretty bad shape by then, but Fred and Helen really put in the hard work to restore it. From what I saw, they did all the renovations and restorations themselves, and they were the first ones to open it as a bed and breakfast in 1972, referring to it as the old Reynolds Mansion.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. The old, yeah. And some of the information that's online, unfortunately, incorrectly describes Billy and Michael purchasing the place and then restoring it and opening it as a bed and breakfast in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
They've confused. Again, it's the Fabers. The Fabers originally opened it as a bed and breakfast. Billy and Michael didn't obtain it until, again, the early 2000s at some point.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah.
So in 1984, as you mentioned, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places, which really helps preserve that building for future generations and really protecting it against some of the things you mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
So when Fred passed away in 2003, Helen ran the bed and breakfast up until about 2008 before she decided to step away from it. And I think, as you mentioned, in 2009, this is when Michael and Billy purchased the property and did their own renovations on top of that.
Yeah.
Because after, obviously with Helen kind of leaving the building dormant for a year and a half there, it had fallen into to some need of repairs from what I understand.
They had some issues, not quite so bad as what had occurred, probably prior to the Fabers obtaining it. I mean, at one point, I do know that back in the 70s, you still had to drive up an old road through kind of a pine forest to get to the Reynolds Mansion. And I do recall at one point it having gotten into a really, really bad state of affairs up there. Probably not quite so much, but I do recall, Billy talking about how there was, some pretty significant need for renovations, even at the time that he and Michael obtained it.
Yeah. So Billy and Michael operated it until, I believe, 2019, when they sold the estate to Paul and Merlin Mansion, who have been operating it as a bed and breakfast since then for the past 5 or so years.
Man, what a fitting last name.
Yeah. Mansion for a mansion.
Real quick, we're going to come back to what you were talking about, and then we'll wrap up the history, and then we are going to get into the even more strange stuff. We've touched on the Hope Diamond. It's already weird, but let me tell you, people, we had to bring in the big guns for this episode because it just gets weirder with this place. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to tell you all about the really, really wild stuff going on with the Reynolds Mansion. We will be back. That's right. You are listening to Ghosts in the Mountains. the still kind of brand new paranormal podcast that talks about everything that you want to hear. Ghost, goblins, Bigfoot, Boojum, the Hodag. We will literally talk about anything, but tonight is a special night indeed, because not only is it our first night with our first guest, it is also my esteemed, the astute, and my brother, the great Micah Hanks. And we are talking about the Reynolds Mansion. Micah, so far, how has your stay been on Ghosts in the Mountains?
Verily, it has been wonderful. Splendid, in fact.
Well, we have both enjoyed having you here. But before the break, we were talking about just the weirdness in general surrounding this odd... It's like every little place in town is a vortex within the bigger vortex. And, you know, the Hope Diamond of all relics comes into play in this random place that you randomly get brought to by, you know, a friend who is also within our strange paranormal circles that we had formed and then also been brought into over the years. But where we were at with this was the Hope Diamond used to literally be on a dog collar running around the Reynolds Mansion. So we've got the history of the Reynolds Mansion. There is obviously a couple of pretty tragic deaths that happen at this place, not to mention the idea that potentially, you know, and I've really never thought about this in the context of the idea of like, you know, did the Hope Diamond itself curse this place? Now, I don't really think personally, I don't really take too much of that into account. And maybe that is also kind of based on a little bit of the folklore of the Hope Diamond as to where it seems to affect the individual. But then again, I don't know. I've never really heard about the Hope Diamond cursing a place. Like you said, it's at the Smithsonian now.
Yeah.
How cursed is that place? I mean,
Well,
maybe we could do an episode on that. Who knows? There might be a deep, dark, crazy history there.
Yeah.
There might just be. So now we need to get into what exactly made this place stick out to paranormal investigators. And Micah, you were very good friends with people that not only were they the owners of the place, did they not live there full time while they were the owners?
Well, yeah, Billy did for the most part. So, you know, when Billy and his partner Michael obtained the house, Billy really took over the job as being, I would like to say, curator, because the house was almost a museum with all the beautiful paintings, with all the memorabilia. Billy, again, with his, you know, interest in the macabre, he had obtained things like, for instance, an original vampire hunting kit that was a prop used in the film The Many Brides of Dracula.
Oh, I remember seeing that while I was there, yeah.
I took you there and I showed you that, and it had a copy of Montague Summers' The Vampire, His Kith and Kin in the book.
Yeah.
In that, well, the book was in the actual thing, and there were, you know, stakes, there was holy water, all kinds of stuff. And there were all kinds of things like that. Figurines of universal monsters. Again, the fact that Billy took this place and not only restored it essentially to how it would have looked back in maybe the 1890s to early 1900s, but that he also bedecked this place with all this monstrous memorabilia. I always had a fondness for that, especially, you know, Barnabas Collins and Dark Shadows. I really enjoyed that show. And as part of the inspiration when I started writing the book, knowing that Billy enjoyed that and had worked a lot of those Dark Shadows motifs into the artwork in the house and everything, I actually started watching that show.
Well, I want to bring something into the lore of this whole thing, because the person that turned me on to Dark Shadows was a good friend of ours, Mr. Matt Hickson.
Yeah.
And Matt Hickson, he literally is one of my best friends in the entire world. I've known him since we were very young. And, you know, I get the text, dude, you ever heard of Dark Shadows? I'm like, no. He's like, dude, black and white, old creepy vampire stuff. Check it out. I grab a bottle of wine because that's what I was doing at the time. I was single, sitting at my house, drinking wine, watching Dark Shadows. Man, I was a loser. No, I'm just kidding. But I was like, you know, that show is a vibe. You know, it's vintage, as some would call it, and it's just cool. They really, in my opinion, I had never seen anything that took place in that particular era that really was kind of like pulling in this spooky vibe like they did. I mean, I think, you know, in the era in which Barnabas Collins comes into the picture, they had something really beautiful and spooky and cool that nobody was doing at the time. And bro, you are in a book somewhere with Matt Hickson on a paranormal investigation. What am I thinking about? Because I've mentioned it so many times, and sorry to cut you off, but I keep saying we're going to do a show where you just come on and you correct all the stuff that we get wrong. This is starting that.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I have a bunch of addendas to things that you guys have talked about and will talk about on the show. That was a book by an author named John Kachuba, and John's still writing. He still appears on shows like Coast to Coast, but John came through Asheville a couple of decades ago, and this would have been back in the Lemur era for us, and
Yeah, I mean, you guys were very young in this picture.
Yeah. Matt and I would have been in our early 20s, and Kachuba was interested in doing a investigation at the Smith McDowell house, and so he went up there, and Matt and I went up, and we took some equipment, and we, took John there for part of his investigation, which made its way into a chapter in the book, I guess, about Asheville while he was here. And so, yeah, you'll see a very young Micah and Matt Hickson in John Kachuba's book. I regretfully don't remember the name of that book. I'll have to figure out which one it was that we appeared in, but it's one of many that John has written. Excellent author who's continued to do that kind of work. But again, that was just one of the many kind of adventures in a historic house in Asheville. To me, I mean, having been in all of them, none of them are as interesting to me as Reynolds Mansion, and for a lot of those reasons I was talking about. I mean, when Billy and Michael obtained it, they really put a whole different spin on that place that gave it a vibe. It wouldn't have been what it was without them, and particularly Billy's, again, curation is how I like to term it, because he was attending to the guests, and he was, the owner of the mansion, and he was running the mansion, but he also was a curator of all this art and all this cool stuff that gave this place this incredible vibe.
Yeah, and that's the thing that makes Billy kind of the point of interest in a lot of ways for this story, because Billy might not have seen and or heard a ton of stuff. And, Mike, I'll let you get into what he experienced. But a lot of the time, what I still to this day think is one of the most fascinating things about the Reynolds Mansion is there were so many people that would come to stay. They wouldn't know diddly squat about there being anything paranormal that would be happening at this place. And they would come up to Billy, and I think specifically multiple instances, they would say, "Who's the little girl?"
Yeah.
How many times did Billy say that would happen?
Can't say.
I
mean, it happened a lot, but I mean, Billy, I tried to, all the significant stories at that time, I tried to document in the book. Some of them, again, one of the early ones was that Billy had said before they had officially opened the house, there were a couple of people who had come up and they had thought it was like an open house thing, and they just showed up knocking at the door, which is not uncommon because back when I was a teenager or in my early 20s, you mentioned our...
I'm writing an article.
Yeah, you mentioned our friend Noah Falloon, and Noah and I and our friend Nick Tipton, and you and I did this a lot, and others too, who were kind of involved in our endeavors, our enterprises back in those days, which were simply, we were in our late teens and early 20s. We were interested in ghosts and stuff, so we would just often go cold calling at historic homes. And here's the fascinating thing. You'd think you'd get turned away a lot and be told, get the hell out of here, don't ever come back. Quite the contrary. I mean, there were so many times where the owners of historic homes, I would show up and respectfully just go up and say, my name's Micah Hanks. Here's who I am, what I do. This is my colleague. We're interested in the history of this house and any experiences you've had. And I mean, we would be invited in.
Dude, I just love that so much because you did this a lot when you were like a kid. I didn't go on a lot of those ones with like you and Noah and Nick where you would literally just knock on a door and just see what kind of experience you would have. But I have had experiences like that since then. It is such a wonderful thing when you go up and they're like, okay, we'll see how this goes. And then, whoever owns the place is like, dude, I love talking about this stuff. Let's go,
Yeah.
It's such a, I don't know, it's like a wonderful communal experience.
Oh, yeah. Owen Sullivan, who was the man who had owned a house, now called the historic Biltmore Inn, but it had previously been known as the Reed House for a time. Owen,
Yeah.
Owen, you just invited Noah and I in one afternoon and just told us all of these incredible stories. Now
I'm sorry, that is the one that's right up on the hill as you're going into Asheville through Biltmore.
Yeah.
Coming from the entrance to the Biltmore house.
It had been the home that was owned by Vanderbilt's lawyer.
Right. Yeah.
He lived in the Reed House. Yeah.
That is another one of those places in town where it's just beautiful, weird, super cool architecture.
And funny thing is many years after, Noah and I sat there and spent a wonderful afternoon with the previous owner, Owen Sullivan, and we sat there and talked about all his incredible experiences. He told us, there are no ghosts here. I've never seen ghosts here, but he says, I've owned bed and breakfasts up and down the East Coast, and I have seen ghosts. Let me tell you, my boy, about the ghosts. He told me incredible stories. Now, the funny thing about Reynolds Mansion, though, is that, unlike all these houses, that I would go and I would try to find I would go and introduce myself. I would pursue stories about these places. Reynolds Mansion just gets dumped in my lap, and it ended up being the most fascinating of them all, the natural laboratory. So,
And also, like, in a point in your life where you didn't really care.
isn't that how it goes?
Yeah.
Isn't that how it goes? I mean, you walk away from this stuff, and then all of a sudden, some fortuitous experiment just introduces itself to you, drops itself in your lap.
Sure.
And so here I am. I'm like, okay, I've got access at any time I basically want it to one of the oldest, most historic homes in Asheville. And it also at one time used to be a place where humans were embalmed. Let me explain. So, you already kind of touched on this a little, Austin, but in one of the early visits up there talking with Billy, he told me, he said, we found out, Nathaniel had run a funeral home in town, Nathaniel Reynolds, who, if you recall, again, Nathaniel, who I believe married Mamie after her husband, his brother, died.
Yeah.
Incestuous little bunch here, but anyway, we'll get it all together. So long story short, Nathaniel had actually operated, the embalming operation out of a building there on the property that actually, by the time I got up there, had served essentially as being one of the guest houses on the property, right? A former garage.
Yeah.
It had been remodeled and turned into a guest house. So Billy said, and this wasn't something that they had tried to do where they said, we're going to bring out some psychics. There was just somebody who came as a guest at the house who had been a psychic, but she came up to Billy and said, I sense a spirit on this property. There's a man, and he's telling me, if I'm remembering the story, again, this is in the book, but it's been years. But he, apparently the woman said that she got this impression from this spirit that he had been embalmed here.
Yeah.
Which is a really strange thing for a ghost to tell you.
Pretty specific, too.
Very specific. Now, Billy, of course, was shocked, and as he told me, he said, Micah, there's no way she could have known that. There is no way. But again, he knew all about the history at that point because Billy, again, an avid history junkie just like me, he had been digging into this, and he said, sure enough, I already knew about Nathaniel and the job that he had had, and the fact that, again, the story had been that, some of the embalming took place there on the property. And so he said, I felt like this woman was clearly picking up on something that could be corroborated with the historical information I've begun to dig into about the house. And I said, well, what else has happened up here? So, I mean, that was the point for me. I'm kind of like, color me intrigued. Okay, what else have we got going on up here? And so some of the stories he told, had been that there had been this, couple who'd shown up. Again, this is, I'd started telling earlier. They kind of thought it was a show house, like it was an open house or something. And they went up and were knocking on the door. Billy finally comes down there and everything. The people said, we were trying to get the attention of the little girl. She came halfway down the stairs, kind of turned around, and then went down the hall the other way. And we couldn't get her to come to the door. And Billy said, there's nobody here but me. He said, what little girl? And they said, well, there was a girl, a young girl who came down the steps. When we went to the front door, this young girl came down the steps, and there's this kind of this landing right there. If you go in the main entrance of the Reynolds Mansion, the staircase goes up, and then there's the landing, and then it goes on up and carries you out on up to the second floor. And they said that this girl stopped on the landing and then went on down the steps and down the hall toward the kitchen and took a left. And Billy said, there is nobody else in this house right now. It's me, and the house was locked. And they said, well, we saw a girl, and we were knocking on the door trying to get her attention, and she came down the stairs and turned around and never acknowledged us. So Billy's like, that was the first moment where I realized maybe there was something going on up here.
Yeah.
But many people would end up telling that same story. They would say that there's a girl who is seen here. And again, presumably, this girl would have been Annie, is the theory, I believe.
That's what I'd seen. And that was a daughter of the original owner of the home, Daniel, right?
I believe so. Daughter of Mamie.
The original, yeah. Yeah.
When I was formally invited to come up there and, start doing research for the book, naturally, they're like, well, you need to stay the night. And so
Naturally.
People were saying, the room where everybody says the activity happens that they associate with Annie is actually a room on the third floor at the top of the stairs to the left, overlooking the garden, and that is called Maggie's room. So I spend my first night in Maggie's room. Now, when I say I spend my first night, I spent very little of that night sleeping in Maggie's room. I stayed up all night. I went downstairs, poured a glass of brandy, and I went and I tried to move. There were very few people, maybe one or two couples that were staying in rooms, and I think they were down on the first floor, so I was just very quiet. But Billy had gone to bed, and he said, you've got full reign of the house, and breakfast is served at this time. So I said, okay, I got to be down there at 8 a.m., I'm just going to stay up all night. And so I did. I walked around.
I got to say, though, that's kind of creepy if you're somebody staying at the Reynolds Mansion and there's just like this kind of... People are already talking about how you look like the painting of Dorian Gray on the wall there.
Oh, yeah.
And there's people that are just saying, imagine
you're one of these people that comes to the hotel and you look at that picture and you're like, wow. Oh, wow. You know, the guy on the book kind of looks like, and maybe the book had not been written at this point, but still, I think it's kind of funny. It's like, you know, the author, and then Micah is literally just roaming around like Barnabas Collins through the hotel in the middle of the night. I mean, like, as innocuous as that is, it's still kind of creepy.
Oh, it was creepy as hell. I mean, it's a beautiful building, but I mean, there are literally portraits of vampires, vampire hunting kits. There were, you know, monstrous figurines and things like this. I mean, all kinds of just macabre stuff that really made this awesome vibe. But, you know, about 2 a.m. sets in. That happened to us a few times up there. Again, that first night I spent in the house, I just went from room to room to room. But again, the thing that captivated me the most that first stay was the portrait of Evie.
Yeah.
I was just fascinated with the story, the tragedy of Evie, only in her 20s, so young, takes her own life. And again, maybe the final victim of the Hope Diamond, but that portrait of her in the drawing room, the fact that I kept having to see it because, you know, to refill my brandy glass, naturally I had to go and literally the brandy bar was right in front of the portrait of Evie. So, I mean, maybe I was exposed to it a little more than the average visitor would have been. But again, that's
the only way to deal with being spooked.
I write about it in the book like that. I mean, there's this captivating thing about Evie and her story to me. And, you know, even though, again, that was just kind of tangent to the broader history, there are so many things about that house. I mean, for instance, there's a basement, there's this under portion. And I used to try to get Billy to let me go down into the basement of the Reynolds Mansion. He would never let me go. Never would ever, never.
Did he not like let us look down there one time?
No, never.
Okay, well, maybe I'm wrong about it.
Okay, we might have. Well, maybe twice.
Well, the only time that I was ever over there, it was during the day, and we just did kind of, you, me, Matt Oakley, and Chris Hayes, we did a preliminary kind of walkthrough of the place, and beautiful. I mean, just ridiculous. The library there, when you walk into the front of the house and you essentially walk to the end of where the wall is, and then you take a right, and there's the whole big library there. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's just a beautiful, beautiful place. But I mean, even being there in the middle of the day, I'm walking around going like, yep, creepy as hell. And like, I don't even really consider myself somebody that is like super sensitive to paranormal activity, but I have had occurrences in my life that have made me question that very thing. Yep. And so walking around there, you know, whether you believe in this stuff or not, I don't know. It's just a little odd. But as far as the hauntings go with this place, are there any other purported hauntings that we have not touched on outside of, you know, well, I know that there's one specifically that is kind of the creme de la creme as far as hauntings go.
You may have to remind me. I mean,
I'm talking about a particular instance that happened with a suitcase, and I think the room in which you stayed in. Okay, I'll tell it how I
can tell it.
Yeah, okay, good.
Yeah, that had happened. That was the reason they put me in Maggie's room. There had been some folks from out of town who stayed in that room, and they were trying to get back into the room one night, and they couldn't get in the room. And so Michael, again, Billy's partner, Michael was back and forth because he had a job in Chicago, and Billy stayed in Asheville the whole time and managed the inn. So at one point, these people, they couldn't get into the room, and so Michael had to go outside the window and scale along the portion of the roof right there on that third floor to get into through the window into Maggie's room, and the luggage had been pushed up against the door.
Yeah.
And it was blocking them from being able to get into the room.
Yeah, I mean...
And they were like, who, while we were gone from within the room, pushed all our luggage up against the door and kept us from getting in? I mean, bizarre.
Yeah, and just showing that Michael literally had to go out the window.
And I talked to him about that. I asked him, I said, you know, can you tell me? I mean, can you confirm that really happened? And he says, yeah. He said, I had to go outside and in through the window to be able to get back in. And he says, and their big luggage, you know, had been pushed up against the door. And the interesting thing, too, is that, and I'll just say this, and I think Billy would probably have agreed, you know, Billy was very kind of open, I think, to these sorts of things, even though he always said, and I'll tell you in a moment what he experienced personally, but he very often emphasized, you know, people tell me stories, but I don't see very much up here. There was one thing that he had experienced personally. Michael, on the other hand, always struck me as being, you know, the kind of, you know, I'm you know, open to the existence of that stuff, but I mean, it's not like a major part of my belief, you know, or whatever. So if that happens, great. If it doesn't, whatever, you know, don't tell me about it. I'll hear about it if I need to.
Yeah.
He just kind of was, you know, he could go either way on that stuff. And the fact that he had personally experienced that was always intriguing to me. And I ended up talking to him about it. Now, the thing that Billy had happen that was really interesting was, again, he had, for the longest time, said, people would always tell me they saw ghosts. I never saw anything. But there was one afternoon, he said, where I was vacuuming right outside what would have been Daniel Reynolds. Again, Colonel Daniel Reynolds, the original builder of the house, his original bedroom, which was back there on the corner on the main floor. Billy had been vacuuming outside Daniel Reynolds' room, and he, in his peripheral vision, sees, he said, what looked like a man with like a long waistcoat. And he said he saw it, and he immediately turns and looks, and there's nobody there. And he said, my immediate reaction to that was, he said, I shouted out loud, I just saw a ghost.
Man.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah, we had a lot of long conversations about this stuff. And again, that Billy described it that way. Again, he did not seem like somebody who ever was like, and I saw this time, and then this other time he was somebody who had never seen anything and really always wanted to, was always being told stories by people about the house that fascinated him. And he was like, I just wish I could see something. And then this one time, he says he's out there, vacuuming, and he gets this impression of this man, which, funny enough, I've never seen a ghost, but I almost had something like that happen in the house myself, where it's like, I would liken it to like you get a psychic impression of something.
Yeah.
And I say this very skeptically. Again, I'm very interested in psychic phenomena and things, and I have had some experiences like that, right? But, some of them are described in the book. There's a room on the 3rd floor called Vera's room, where during the first walkthrough that I did when Marty called me up there that day and Billy took me on a tour, back there in Vera's room, there was like an old-timey bathtub. And as I went in the room, turned around, I was going back out, and as I'm coming back out, bam. It hit me like that.
And it wasn't like you saw anything. It was almost like an image in your mind.
I didn't see anything with my eyes. No, it was like I just got this impression in my mind of this man laying in that bathtub, like on death's doornail.
With a guy in a dog costume.
It was like Shining type stuff.
That's what I'm saying. Because it's funny because I get visions, and I call them visions because they are visions. I get visions like that all the time, being in places like that. But the one thing that I will say, and I'm just going to pop off on a little pseudoscientific rant, sort of scientific, maybe I'll call it. The idea of people experiencing things that happen in their peripheral vision. I am no stranger to this. In fact, it is very well documented on an old episode of Travel Channel's Guts and Bolts, where you and I and Josh Warren and the rest of the Lemur team, we did an investigation of the Capitol building in Raleigh, and I saw something out of my peripheral vision that, oddly enough, the security cameras captured not in their peripheral vision, captured exactly what I saw out of my peripheral vision very well. And I've spoken with Austin on this podcast a couple of times about this idea of people that have that extra number of what are called cones in their eyes, and they are able to see a little bit more into the infrared spectrum than most people are. And that actually is like a somewhat, fairly documented scientific happening. Does make me wonder. It's like, is there something that's going on with the length of the cones? When you think about the human eye being essentially a lens, when you look at a lens, there is distortion of most lenses. And the human eyeball is a circular thing, so there's, got to be some kind of distortion. It almost makes me think that there is a particular distortion in our peripheral vision that is seeing into the infrared spectrum that is allowing people to unwillingly see random stuff like that.
That's the idea. The whole thing is those rod cells, the cones and the rods are the two different kinds. And I guess the rod cell, if I'm remembering correctly, their dispersal is closer to the edges of the retina, right?
Yeah.
The idea is that, and those are also the most sensitive to infrared, like you're saying.
Yeah.
And you're able to see better in, half-light kind of situations. So an interesting little corollary for this, and this is really well known, but...
And I'm sorry if what I just said, sorry to interrupt. I'm sorry if what I just said is common knowledge to a lot of people. I'm not a biologist. I don't know these things.
I don't know if it's common knowledge, but it's certainly something that's talked about. And the interesting thing is where I actually read about that was in probably one of Ashita Kim's books back in the day, Secrets of the Ninja. You might say that that's the more pseudoscientific sort of side of ninjutsu compared to like Stephen Hayes, and some of the guys who are the serious practitioners. But I found Ashita Kim's books interesting. That was totally a pseudonym, by the way. But the book Secrets of the Ninja talks about that, how, the ninja reportedly, because they would work by cover of night and they would, don dark clothing so they could blend into the shadows, they began to learn that they could learn to look with their peripheral vision so that they could, because in half-light situations where there's very little illumination, you can see better with your peripheral vision. They understood that far back, and he was writing about that. But yeah, biologically, that is understood. Now, interestingly, there have been also some tests that were done with Air Force pilots where they were also trained to be able to, see with their whole eye and not just be looking ahead. And if you think about this, I mean, a lot of us, I can be looking at like Austin right here, but I mean, I can be seeing without looking around the room. I'm looking at you. Our eyes are funny how they work because we focus on one thing, but I am aware of the fact that there's a light right there. There's a vent right there. I can see the ceiling. I can see the carpet. I can see lighting beside me. I can see this thing. What is that? What have I got my hand? Oh, God, I just burned my hand.
Lava.
The seafoam green Aston Martin, but I digress.
Yeah, what's it doing over there? How do you fit that in this thing?
Look, this is a TARDIS. It's bigger on the inside. So essentially, there are some very, very, very prominent and strange hauntings that are not only being experienced by these people that have lived in this place, but people that don't know anything about these occurrences happening, yet they are essentially corroborating these and experiencing these things and reporting these to, at the time, the owners. So with that out of the way, I think that's pretty much all of the hauntings, unless, Austin, do you got something else you want to throw in there?
Yeah, I just think use the term synchronicity in the book to describe a lot of this, which I think is, commonly known as a meaningful coincidence, which I think is kind of a good description for a lot of some of these occurrences, especially with Billy's experience seeing the figure of the man on that floor, almost kind of synchronous to what you saw in your vision in your head a little bit there, I would say. So, and again, tying it all together with what we were discussing there, again, it's in his peripheral vision that he had that sighting, which is something that's a common description in, the paranormal. There was, of course, also the culmination of the investigations, which in the final chapter of the book, it's described, we did a seance up there, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is, all right, You're the crazy man who's like, all right, well, I'm already pretty sure this place is haunted, so let's just double down on this thing.
Yeah, so what actually had happened was somebody had mailed me from Australia a Ouija board, and he had said, he had sent it to other people in various parts of the world and had, podcast hosts sign this Ouija board, and he said, I want you to sign it, and then if you would, just mail it either to this next podcast host to have them sign it.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and so he was mailing this thing around the world to get it signed by all his favorite podcasters. And while I had it, I said, well, I'll tell you, I'll do one better for you. While I have your Ouija board in my possession, if you don't mind, I'm going to use it as part of a seance at Reynolds Mansion.
See, I didn't realize that is like where that's so cool. What a fun thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, we'd already done this, we did a live radio broadcast on my podcast, which at the time was called The Gralien Report. Matt Oakley, Chris Hayes, and I, we were up there. Billy was live in the library, and we did the broadcast there with Billy telling all the stories. It's storming and windy outside, and Billy's sitting there telling us stories, and we're live in the library doing the broadcast. It was incredible.
Which is very funny, because here we are, live, talking about it. It is 14 degrees outside, and the wind is audible through our headphones right now.
Yeah.
So I feel like this is just like another weird, wonderful little synchronicity about that.
About to say, going back to that synchronicity term.
Yeah, I mean, and I remember that night, we did the broadcast, and then as he would always do, Billy just said, just lock the door on your way out, and gave us basically, free reign and let us kind of go around the house. And there was this, we left at about 3 a.m. I think that Matt had to leave earlier. Chris and I were the last ones there that night. This is not the same night as the seance, but we're leaving the night of the broadcast. And we go outside, and there are these dogs just barking like hell. It was the strangest thing. And I wrote about that in the book.
On the mansion property that happened?
It was, yeah. There was this dog that goes barreling ass through the garden, and I could hear these dogs just barking like hell down there. It ended up being like a big part of that chapter.
Yeah. It almost plays as like an omen of sorts.
It was.
And I remember reading that in your book, and I just loved that part because you made it sound like it was fiction, but it actually wasn't. The way that you wrote that, happened. I thought that was so fun because you're describing the howl of the hellhounds in the distance. It's just, when you know this building and you've seen it, and then you read something like that, again, it just like enriches the lore of the entire situation.
When it's 3 a.m. and the wind is blowing and the clouds were blowing past like a moon right up above the house and everything, and literally these dogs are just barking like hell. And one of them runs right through the garden right there. And Chris and I literally, it was about 3 a.m. We walk out and we're like, what in the hell just ran by? I mean, it was really creepy, but
yeah.
And again, I'll just say everything in the book is true, including there's this introduction to one of the chapters where I talk about going up into this part of the mansion I'd never found, and there being these alabaster railings, and I go out onto this, and it's an older time. But the higher I go, obviously, I'm 8 floors up, and I realize this is not the Reynolds Mansion I know, and I'm in this building doing something, but it is Reynolds Mansion. That also happened. That was really a dream I had. I see very vividly the way that again, I use the term alabaster to describe, this very ornate kind of area. Now, what's going on there psychologically? And I have the same dream about my own house. The little house I lived in for years, I used to have this dream, and it was really funny. I would always dream that somehow in that house, this little, house that I lived in, that I would find a whole different area. And that the house was much bigger than I knew, but that there was a part of the house I'd never go in. Psychologically, what you're experiencing is
exactly what we were thinking about with the books.
What is that?
With the books. There is so much more to this area. There's so much more to this world. There's got to be something else there. That's my interpretation.
Well, my interpretation is that, psychologically, it's like, with Reynolds Mansion, finding additional floors, buildings, and the mansion turns into a palace in my dream. What that meant was there are unexplored parts of this house and things I don't know about it that I can't access. But in my dreaming mind, I was trying to find my way into, and it leads me into this strange archetypal dreamlike realm.
Yeah. Exactly. That's you looking for UFOs. That's you looking for Sasquatch. That's me in my heartfelt, lifelong, devout search for the reptilian alien chupacabra and not the mangy dog chupacabra.
Yeah.
That's to me, archetypally, that's exactly what's going on.
I'll put it out to your listeners. I mean, again, how many of you out there listening have had that experience where you have a dream about your house, but there's a part of your house that you didn't know existed, and you find this mysterious part of your house in your dream? Have you ever had that dream?
I've had that. I have almost a fictional house that I revisit in my dream. It's not my actual house, but I consistently revisit the same house in multiple dreams, and it's always the same thing, discovering new parts of it.
Yeah.
You guys ever have that dream where you're naked and you're standing on top of a pyramid and people are throwing little pickles at you? Anyway, so moving right along. Don, I call my brother Don sometimes.
Hi, everybody. I'm Don.
And I didn't even think about calling you Don. So it's out. The public knows we call each other Don. It's a thing. So Don, brother Micah.
Yes, Don.
You. It's hilarious. You're getting into this instance with the seance, and you have another strange experience. Is this while you're having the seance? Sorry, I'm trying to not give anything away, but tell us about this experience of the seance, because, I think there's some other very strange stuff that the listeners would love to hear.
Well, so the idea behind the seance really had been dark shadows. Right. I thought, and I think it was in the second season of Dark Shadows, they end up having this seance. And Billy and I had been talking about this, and I said...
And sorry, spoilers from a show that came out in the 50s, I think.
Well,
the seance was supposedly to talk to Josette, was it not?
Josette. Yeah, maybe so. I don't know.
Anyway,
it was a little later than the 50s. I mean, it was like the 70s maybe. But anyway, Billy, again, being also a fan of Dark Shadows, and I began watching it as inspiration while writing the book about the house. We were talking one day, and I said, I think the final chapter of the book, after we finish all the investigation, all the research, all the history, we should do a seance. So we did. And for that seance, Matt and Chris, my co-hosts on the podcast, Lisa Northrup, a friend of mine up in Highlands, North Carolina, Marty Marfia was also there. We got together. We had the Ouija board that had been mailed to me by the listener. And we took that and we went to a couple of different locations in the house, but ultimately we went to Maggie's room with that. Everybody was too scared to touch the Ouija board except for Matt Oakley and I. And there wasn't much that happened with the Ouija board. I wish I could tell you that there was this incredible, moment where Maggie or Annie or whomever spelled out their name. We didn't have that happen. The only thing that happened, and this was kind of odd, when Matt and I both put our hands on our makeshift planchette, the pointing device that she used.
A can of sardines.
Yeah, no, it was a little pointer that we created, but no, I mean, it just kept coming down to when we would ask a question, is there a spirit here? Is there anything going on? It just kept going with only my and Matt Oakley's hands on the planchette. It would just go to the letter I. We would say, is there anyone here? And it would just say I.
How did you interpret that?
Well, so yeah, that's sort of interesting to me too. I don't know. One could interpret that as being if there were some external presence, it was saying, I am here. I am here. And it was using economy of motion. One could say that if we were to look inward, Matt and I, we were asking, is there anyone here? And we were seeing subconsciously, we were moving the planchette and saying, I am here, meaning he and I don't know. We didn't know. But that was still an interesting response to get from a couple of guys who we lean skeptical.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Matt and I are not people who are like, we believe there's a ghost here. Full stop. Now let's talk with it. We weren't like that. We weren't coming into it with that attitude. We were going very, very much in that scientific kind of sense. We were like, let's really try to engage in a experiment and just be as blank slate, open-minded as we can be, and let's go in here and see what happens. And so we do that.
And sorry, just to interject. I mean, the idea, I was always weirded out by Ouija boards because our mother was like, don't you ever mess with one. Don't you ever touch one. Don't you ever mess with one because they're, that is a gateway into something we don't understand. And I'm not going to sit here today and say that I do not think that said Ouija board could not have the potential to do that. However, I was introduced to a Ouija board one night by none other than Joshua P. Warren because, hey, we're in the Warren verse. His rules, we just live in it. I was like, I'm not touching that thing. And he was like, bullshit, Caleb. We're going to go downstairs. We're going to do the Ouija board. And I was freaked out. He's like, it's fine. And Warren, in that instance, he had some scientific things that he was kind of saying. Maybe he has changed his view on the Ouija board in years since. So I'm not really going to give specifics about exactly what we talked about that night. But as I do remember, there was speak of this thing called automatism, I believe it is called.
A subliminal muscular kind of a thing.
Tiny movements that you're not really aware of.
Kind of this idea that we are actually moving the thing. Also the idea of like when you're holding a pendulum in your hand, the same thing is going on.
Automatism, yeah.
At the time, I was kind of weirded out by it, but just to say that there is still this potential that is a thing. I've always thought that with a Ouija board, there's all these hands on it, and it's like, I don't think it's minuscule muscle anything. I think it's, frankly, people moving it. That being said, what happens when people all collectively are looking to make something happen and then using something potentially as a totem? That I still put in this box of this idea of sometimes I think human beings tap into what I will refer to as sciences that we don't understand yet, and we are somehow potentially influencing the universe around us. And that also kind of gets into the idea of voodoo, but I'm going to kind of leave it there because the Ouija board is still out for me. But I do think what the interesting part of that is the mental aspect of where a collective group of people's consciousness goes when using something like that. And they kind of maybe open up something in the collective mind.
I've got Ouija board stories I could tell you, and at some point, maybe on a future episode, I will share some of those because I've got some that really challenge the idea of pure, simple automatism. But again, I think that's what's going on. I think that was what was happening with what Matt and I experienced. Now, that wasn't the only automatic phenomena that we were experiencing because we also employed a pendulum.
Yeah. Let's talk about that. I think used it for basically a yes/no question-answer session.
Yeah, again, Lisa, who had been there with us, she had used, I think she brought the pendulum. She'd given me a pendulum, actually. I probably still have that pendulum, in fact. But she had given that to me as a guest, as a gift, and so we tried the pendulum too and just did very simpler, yes/no kinds of questions. That was one of a few experiments we did. So there was the Ouija board, the pendulum, and then ultimately what we also ended up doing was and yes, the pendulum was most receptive, I think, when Lisa was working it.
Yeah, wasn't there a situation where the lights and power almost had a surge when she was performing some of this?
That's true. Yeah, that really happened. Yeah, we were there, and when she took the pendulum and began working it, again, you'd hold it over some sort of a little, sometimes you can just simply say, go in a circle for no and, right, left for yes or whatever. Mm-hmm. when she began using it, we had the power started flickering, and we were all freaked out by that. And actually, I still somewhere have the recordings of the entire session that we did at Reynolds.
Cool.
Yeah, I recorded the entire thing.
Yeah.
So we have the audio of everybody going, "Oh God, the power is going out" when Lisa took the pendulum.
Uh-huh.
So we did that, and then there was finally this psychometry experiment we did where up in Maggie's room, Matt and I had just done the Ouija board, and then we ended with a final experiment where we each took a book and pointed to a line. Again, the lines were the most synchronistic thing because everybody's line, we again each grabbed a random book off of the shelf in Maggie's room, and we end up just reading a random, we open to a random page, point to whatever sentence without looking, read that. Everybody's sentence was something relevant to what was going on.
That's pretty interesting.
Well, it was extremely interesting in the sense that, again, if we look at all this through a psychological lens, everything that happened during that seance, ultimately I'm looking for ghosts, but I'm open to whatever else might, happen. The great laboratory of Reynolds Mansion ended up giving us this very introspective experience at the end where really we all went up there and we had a very classic parapsychological experience where the lines between what's happening and what influences might be coming externally and what humans tend to interpret through our, senses, see happening around us externally, and what we tend to, interpret and maybe ascribe agency toward. There's this long tradition of seeing stuff happening in the world around us and going, oh my gosh, ghost, demon, ancestor, jinn, angel.
Spike. Sorry, Buffy fan.
Yeah, we ascribe agency to things that are happening. And so again, somewhere between, people really do have weird experiences here in this mansion, and a bunch of humans went in here with intent and tried to see what would happen when they conducted some parapsychological experiences. Somewhere between those two kind of perspectives, there was this seance.
Does that not remind you of House on Haunted Hill? Is that the old movie
Sure.
where it's like, they're doing the psychological experiment in this house and the guy's instructing this girl, I think she's like levitating, maybe not levitating, but he's like, deposit the ectoplasm in the jar. Do you remember this movie?
Yeah, and the book it was based on. Again, the archetype. That's the archetype. Here's a haunted house. Let's get a group of people together. Let's go up there and let's do an experiment. And that's exactly what happened in Dark Shadows too. So yeah, we lived that experience. Of course, with the full permission of the owner. Billy, I wanted to be part of the seance, and he ended up having, he's running the whole house.
Yeah,
so
not just the permission, encouragement.
Oh yeah. Well, it was a wonderful experience to be able to have somebody say, "Hey, come up here, study this house, and study it in what ways you feel are fit and best equipped for what you're trying to learn." And then the book was kind of born out of that. So where we came away from all that, and again, the epilogue is, Billy and I are talking. The whole investigation ends with the same sort of thing that it began with, this conversation. And yeah, I came away from that whole experience kind of looking more at like spiritual phenomenon as being one of maybe two things. There's this side of it for me where I'm like, okay, this is a very human thing, and our expectations are projected onto our environment, and things that happen we interpret as such. But then there's also that interesting kind of time slip-esque component where I couldn't completely explain the stories of Annie being vividly described by people who would visit the house and say, yeah, we saw this girl standing right there and she couldn't see us. We could see her. It's like we were watching a movie play, right?
So that imprint in time.
Like an
deal.
imprint, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, also, that always opens up this idea of consciousness and its role within the time and or dimension in which it is experiencing at the time in which we perceive as being linear.
Well, and again, Hawking talked about the thermodynamic arrow of time, which is an interesting idea because he says there are reasons why we can see the past, i.e. memory, but we can't see the future. And I've wondered if there is indeed a thermodynamic arrow of time and a time slip occurs where there are 2 points in which times intersect. A person from the future is seeing somebody from the past and they're like, okay, I can see that ghost, but that ghost can't see me. Well, think about that. That's in keeping with the thermodynamic arrow of time in the sense that for that ghost, her future, the people who see her, has not happened yet. And if time really does have a thermodynamic limitation in terms of the arrow in which it flows, i.e. our perception of it goes one way, she couldn't see them because they're from the future, but they could sure as hell see her because their past has already happened, and here she is, a representation of it that somehow intersects with their temporal reality. They see that, and they're like, I can see her, but she has no idea we're here. I mean, that almost is theoretically in keeping with that concept of entropy and its relationship with the arrow of time that Hawking and others have described. That always fascinated me.
And maybe this is like part and parcel to exactly what you're talking about. But, you hear all of these ideas of like the onion skin dimensions. You and I, Micah, we frequently speak about Jacques Vallée, who, hey, quick plug, who's going to be on your show?
Yeah, he'll be on the show very soon.
I think this is actually going to be coming out after that episode comes out, so it's not like I'm spoiling anything for any of the Micah Hanks Program listeners. And by the way, big old plug, if you haven't Googled him yet, the Micah Hanks Program is Micah's show that he does. He's also editor-in-chief of the debrief.org. And this idea of dimensionality, and I always kind of look at this in context to, there are two specific paranormal ghostly phenomenon that I hear all the time. One is, well, you know what? I'm going to put a third category. It's basically part of one, but it's very specific, and I'm going to make its own category. Number one, the ghost sees you, acknowledges you, gets out of there. That happens a lot. The getting out of there is not very specific. It's not important. It's the ghost acknowledging you. That's one thing. The secondary phenomenon is a ghost that appears, you witness it, and it's like the Beatles song, I'm looking through you. It seems to just not acknowledge your presence. And I think that these are maybe two sides of the same coin, or maybe two different coins. Is this an interdimensional rift, kind of like we were talking about on our Chimney Rock episode, where the entire town witnesses this crazy thing happening above their town? They all see some sort of what they describe as essentially a ghostly apparition, be it multiple entities. And they all, as a town, had a council, essentially. They got together, had a town meeting about it, and they all came to the conclusion collectively that there was some kind of time slip that had happened. So it's kind of this thing of like, there is really no way for us to scientifically pinpoint what this phenomenon actually is. But there definitely does seem to be degrees that are observable through God knows how many experiences people have that are differing. And I don't know, maybe the ghosts that seem like they're not experiencing other people, maybe they are and they're just ignoring us. But there have been multiple reports that it's almost like they're seeing these apparitions doing the same things. They're repeating the same tasks. They're in the same places. So again, it's like, I think that's one of the things we're trying to figure out. Like, what is even going on with this?
Yeah, it's like you're looking for a window to a specific moment in time in the past almost.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, sorry to get off on a big tangent with that whole thing. But as far as, your experience and the Reynolds Mansion and what I'm assuming is probably still going on there today, and maybe the current owners are not talking about it. Maybe they do. I don't really know.
Yeah, I reached out to them this week, and they said that they have not experienced anything in the 5 years they've been there. So,
well, of course, Austin, dude.
I didn't get my boots on the ground, but I sent an email, so that counts for something.
That's fantastic. I mean, but I think that's kind of interesting, And again, it's this interpretive lens. Maybe Billy wanted to see stuff. Maybe he just had a natural propensity to be able to see this stuff.
Well, he only saw that one thing.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. It's just like, just Billy and Michael just like even seeing anything.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's like maybe they were just biologically more able to see this stuff. Maybe they were just mentally more facilitating being able to see this stuff. That's just what makes this entire phenomenon so strange and hard to record, hard to figure it out, hard to get hard evidence to look at it analytically.
Yeah.
I just want to say, so Brother Micah, do you have any closing statements on your experience at the Reynolds Mansion that you want to put out there to the people?
No, I mean, I think we've kind of covered everything, really. It's, it's a fascinating building. And again, really, even if people aren't as interested in that idea of, spirit phenomena and things like that. I mean, the book was very much at the request of Billy to, kind of document the history of the house. And that's really what I was fundamentally doing, telling the story of that house and the people who had owned it, including Billy and Michael. but telling ghost stories along the way while documenting the house's history. So, I mean, I always considered it a history project, which happened to also include a bunch of ghost stories. Now, again, the house, it remains open to the public if you are a guest and you are staying there. And I've not met the current owners, but again, I think it's wonderful that the place is still, if you are a guest, if you're coming to Asheville and you want to visit, that is a option. Please consider, reaching out to the Reynolds Mansion, staying there, enjoying the beautiful scenery that our town has to offer, even in post-Hurricane Helene. It's a wonderful place. And even though I've kind of hung up my ghost hunting gear, I don't do that anymore. I don't really write about that subject. It's always in the back of my mind. And that book and that experience at Reynolds Mansion, certainly is probably one of the more in-depth kind of ongoing experiments, really, that kind of, at very least closed that chapter of that very unique book in my life.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, bro, you close that chapter, and your little brother's going to reopen it. You say you've hung up the Ghostbusters cowl. You say you've put your PKE meter in storage. Somebody's coming to break you out of that. And that guy is me. We're going to get back in the saddle one day, my friends. And I'm going to tell you right now, I know exactly when, and I know exactly where.
Oh, do you now?
Yes, I do. Because we are going to do a paranormal investigation. We're going to do the whole shebang like we did back in the day. You, me, Austin, we're all going to go to the Lake Lure Inn, and we are going to do a paranormal investigation. And also, like you were talking about, trying to build this community back after Hurricane Helene. Lake Lure and Chimney Rock are two communities that I know are still in dire need, and we're going to give back to that community as best we possibly can. And we're going to look into this stuff as much as we possibly can and have a really cool experience in the meantime. Austin, my man, dude, incredible work on the history side, as you always do. Do you have any closing thoughts or questions or anything about this as we're coming to a close?
I will just throw something out to Micah here. In the afterword of your book, you make a statement that your experiences at the mansion have almost entirely changed your perception on what a ghost may or may not be. And I think you've touched on that some, but my question is, 10 plus years after writing the book, do those experiences still shape what you feel a ghost may or may not be?
This is probably not the subject, or rather the response that everybody hopes for. I don't, I do kind of think about Reynolds Mansion from time to time. I don't really think about ghosts all that much. I guess it's kind of like the Dos Equis guy, I don't think about ghosts often, but when I do,
I'm shithouse.
I think about Reynolds Mansion while I'm drinking a Dos Equis. Yeah, I do. It's true. I do think about Reynolds Mansion periodically. I don't really think about ghosts all that much, but I will say that what I gathered from the way people describe things that they experienced up there, again, it comes back to that whole thing about it's very easy for a human to go into an environment and experience what they want to. Mm-hmm. And I, saw some people who clearly the stories they told about ghosts and experiences at Reynolds Mansion, to me, I'm like, yeah, you came up here and you saw an old house. You have this experience every old house you go to, and again, the owners were not like that. They were like, we never see anything up here except for the one thing that Billy had happen. And then what you might call secondhand experience Michael had where he has to go through the window to get back into the room and everything's piled up against the wall. He never saw anything strange. He simply couldn't explain how did all your luggage get up against the door from inside the room. And so those were the only two firsthand, kind of experiences that they had, which was compelling to me because they weren't just constantly seeing stuff all the time. Obviously, I think some of their visitors probably did have a tendency to experience paranormal stuff everywhere they went. Mm-hmm. And Billy would tell you that. I remember he and I talked about that a lot. Then there were other people who would tell really compelling stories. Again, the woman who claimed to be psychic, who told the story about the embalming. We had no way of explaining how she possibly could have known or had access to that information prior to coming to the home.
Well, I will just say, and I'm not naming names, but you and I have known people that have exhibited very convincing psychic ability.
Yep.
I have also encountered many, many, many people who have claimed to have ability, and I thought they were full of crap.
I know a lot of people who claim that they have psychic abilities, and I've never had them demonstrate to me reliably or convincingly that they actually possess those abilities. Then I have people who do. Now, I've had some experiences myself. Austin, you'd said you were going to ask me about a kind of a vision that I had involving the death of a guy.
Yeah. So in your book, you basically describe what I would almost describe as a psychological premonition of the death of a family friend.
Yeah. That man had been a member of the church where my father was a Episcopal priest.
Mm-hmm.
And the funny thing about that was, there had been like a large marble fixture at the back of the church that was actually commemorating work that he and his wife had done for the church. And I remember I was laying on my bed looking out the window one day, and just randomly that marble slab with his name on it, which I had interpreted as being a tombstone.
That's what I always thought too. I remember exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, it was actually commemorating work that they had done.
Kind of like a pink granite, right?
Yeah, but I remember looking at it and going, "Yeah, that's weird. They got a tombstone back there, for him, and he's still alive." Well, anyway, So long story short, that flashed through my mind, and I was like, "Huh." Guy's name was Mitchell.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the next day my parents came over for breakfast, and my dad comes in the door and he's got a hat on. He takes his hat off. He goes, "Well, Mitchell Buckner died." And that was exactly who, that. And
that was the day after you'd had that, right?
The very day afterwards. So I didn't say anything about it at that point, but then later I told my dad about it, and I said, that day that you came over and you told me that Mitchell had died, I had this just a quick little fleeting thing where I'd just been laying on the bed looking out the window, and this image flashed through my mind where I saw that his tombstone, and Dad goes, "Aha, but that's where you're wrong. It wasn't a tombstone." He said it was a commemorative thing. And I'm like, "Well, Dad."
It's still a mental association with the person
who just died. And the weirdest part about all that was, and this is true, I'd asked him, I'd said, "What time do you think he died?" And he said, "I think he passed away at about noon on Thursday." And they'd come over Friday morning for breakfast. And it'd been noon on Thursday. I've been looking out the window, and his name flashes through my mind. Now, my longtime friend Tiffany Mack and I, we've discussed these things a lot, and she has had similar things happen. I don't claim to be psychic, whatever that was that happened to me, cosmic ping back, I don't know. Tiffany, I remember there was there was an earthquake that struck some part of Central America, and she'd had a dream, and she called me and she said, "I saw terracotta buildings just falling apart, just being shaken all to shit." And I said, "Tiffany, there was a earthquake last night." And so we began a formal, well, not really a super formal, but I mean, we began to keep a log of dreams that she had that seemed to relate to things that were happening. And then we decided to take it a step further. We began to do experiments with Zener cards. Tiffany and I did some experiments where, and again, Tiffany, she's one of my very best friends, longtime friend of mine, married, got kids. She lives up in Kentucky. I'm down here in North Carolina. So most of these experiments were done over Skype.
Mm-hmm.
And
you guys were getting into Russell Targ territory.
We were, yeah, because I was just intrigued and I said, let's see if we can document some of this. And sure enough, one of the most striking experiences, we were doing a remote viewing experiment.
I think I remember you telling me about this.
Yeah, she and her daughters had been, well, I won't tell you what they've been doing yet, but she said, "Okay, I'm going to, here's the target. I got it in my mind. Now you remote view it and tell me what I'm looking at." And I said, "Okay, I'm seeing like a gingerbread house and a fireplace, right?" And the cool thing is that what the remote viewing target she had selected was she and her daughters had built they'd made a bunch of gingerbread that weekend before. She had made a gingerbread house, which had fallen apart since, but it was still sitting up there on top of the mantle over the fireplace in their house.
That's pretty interesting.
I did that, and I was like, that's incredible. So, but the question I had, and I've met Russell Targ and, a lot of those folks, and Targ being, of course, a colleague of Jacques Vallée, I was intrigued by the fact that Tiffany, I don't normally have those kinds of experiences, but when Tiffany says I'm going to pick the target, and of course she and I have a rapport, we're good friends, then I'm able to do that. When she and I are consciously involved in an experiment. But one of the weirdest ones with her had been, one morning she and I had gone a long time for whatever reason, which is pretty rare because we're normally in touch a lot. She, back during Helene, her husband Brent was calling, every day to check in on me. "Micah, how you doing?" And back a few years back, we had been out of touch for a while. And I remember waking up early one morning and just going, "We have not been in touch. Tiff, if you get this," and I just, in my mind said, "If you get this message, reach out." And I fell back asleep. It was really early in the morning. I wake up to a text message from her. And I literally just wrote back and I said, "Did you get the message?" And she goes, "Well, and just made some sort of vague comment about it and everything. But I asked her about it later. I said, "I literally woke up early that morning thinking about you, and we hadn't talked, and I was like, I'm going to see if you get the message." And I woke up to a text message from her. So, I mean, I don't know why, sometimes we just have a unique connection with people, right? And
well,
I mean, specifically jumping back to that premonition part of your book with Mitchell, that really hit home for me because within the past year, I had a pretty eerily similar experience. I'd say mine was more of a dreamlike state than a kind of vision premonition. It was, I'd almost describe it as that kind of sleep paralysis state when you're not quite asleep, not quite awake, just kind of that in between, laying in bed, heard my name called out, all in my head, mind you. And I instantly knew who it was. It was an old friend of mine I'd fallen out of touch with. And the voice kind of went on to say some version of either I've been dying, I have died, and at this point, I've passed on, and I'm so sorry. I just wanted to let you know. Woke up in kind of a cold sweat, freaked out, checked social media because, I think that's kind of the first thing, look for that, look for an obituary, nothing. Checked those things for the next few days, still nothing. I think I just kind of wrote it off as a weird, crazy dream. And then fast forward 6 months later, come to find out that she had actually passed away right around the time that I had that sort of premonition. So
it's unbelievable.
Yeah, that one.
Very sorry, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
I appreciate that.
Hey, well, man, you and I have talked a little bit about this before, and I love you. That was not an easy thing to go through. A lot of stuff that we do experience in this kind of state to where it's like people that have passed on or passing on or through whatever the means of communication, however the receptor we have, they do reach out. It's a wild phenomenon, but I think it's honestly, whatever it is, I've heard of so many people experience this that, I've said so many times on the podcast that I kind of go back and forth between this idea of like, I believe in the afterlife. I don't believe in the afterlife. I don't know. I really do I just kind of fluctuate between it. But I will say that if I had to say right now, like, do you think there is something else? I would say, yeah. And that is because just all of the data, all of the stories, there are so many people that I know that have experienced stuff like this. And why would they be lying? And I also equate this to, we were talking about before the podcast, there's this idea that either dopamine is being pumped into the human body or glands are pumping you full of drugs when you're on your deathbed. But it is noteworthy, at least, that so many people, right before they pass on, they see people they know. It is what it is. Skeptics out there might sit there and listen to what we're saying right now and be like, bullshit, it's all bullshit. This is something that the body does as a mechanism to allow the human body to not feel as much pain as it passes on. And that's a fair point. But the things that I have heard people describe in the periphery and surrounding other people passing on, I'm just going to categorize it as that is noteworthy.
That kind of just opened my eyes. Like you've mentioned, I've never thought of myself as someone that was particularly perceptive to any of that.
Yeah.
So that was really the first kind of experience I had with something that I couldn't really scientifically explain.
Well, let me just say, when you and I have talked about that in the past, that is something that hits both of us pretty hard emotionally. So I just want to say, thanks for talking about it, dude. Thank you for sharing that experience with our listeners, because I bet you there's a bunch of people listening to this podcast right now that have experienced the exact same thing. But tying this together on what I think has been in nature a supernatural podcast, because, man, we have run the gamut. Curses, crazed hellhounds, frickin' ghosts, luggage that moves on its own accord. I mean, that is why we had to bring in the top dog, the man that literally wrote the book on the Reynolds Mansion, and my brother. If you do not know the breadth of this dude's work, he is still a young man, and he has done so much in this field it would blow your mind. Go to MicahHanks.com. Listen to the Micah Hanks Program. It is on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, every frickin' thing that you listen to. Brother Micah, you've been somebody that's helped me out in my life. We've fought like crazy, and we've been best friends, and I am just so happy that we both are kind of, finding ourselves in the weird world I guess we were destined to be in. So, man, thank you so much for being on this podcast, and I just hope that we all find what we're looking for. And any last words?
Nah, I'm good, man. You can call me Don.
Oh yeah, Don. I don't want to say any last words, any last thoughts.
It's cold outside. The roads are kind of weird. So either way.
That's true. Yeah, I'm looking at this lava lamp and becoming increasingly entranced. So
Hypnotized.
the road may be beckoning me. Who knows? Maybe sometime we'll have to tell stories of Skinwalker Ranch.
Oh, well, maybe when we do that, we'll actually have even weirder stories to tell out there. Well, I guess that brings this episode of Ghosts in the Mountains to a close. And I just want to say, as always, to everyone out there in the world that happens to be listening to this podcast, number one, thank you so incredibly much for checking out the pod. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. If you want to find more or hear more, go to ghostsinthemountains.com. If you or anyone you know has a paranormal experience that they would like to share with us on the podcast, go to ghostsinthemountains.com to our contact page that has our email address, ghostsinthemountains@gmail.com, and send us your story. We would love to hear your stuff, and we would be happy to talk about it, read it on the air, give our opinion on what's going on there. Heck, maybe we would even do a dramatization like we do every once in a while. But one last thing, I just want to thank Mr. Austin Burgess. Buddy, thank you so much for your work on this podcast, and thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing some personal stuff with us tonight.
Oh, thanks for listening to me. Honestly, it's one of those things that's nice to talk about.
Heck yeah, brother man. Well, I love you a lot.
I love you too, dude.
Micah Hanks, thanks again for everything. It's been a good time.
You guys stay strange out there, okay?
Absolutely.
We'll do our best.
And with that, this concludes another episode of Ghosts in the Mountains. Thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see you all next time.